All right, looks like we're on air. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 4th of May, 2016, and today we're going to talk a little bit about high-pass filters and what they are, when you might want to use them, and when you may not want to use them. So let's go ahead and dive in. There was one question that came across from Gary Davies, and his question is, let's go take a look and see. All right, here we are. Is there any difference in the long run between using high-pass filters during the recording process or after in the post-processing of a project? And of course, as per usual, Gary, that's a very good question. And I don't want to answer that just yet. I think we want to talk about what high-pass filters are. And in fact, I think you asked a great question because that's one of the questions I wanted to address from during the session as well. So hold on to that, and we will definitely get to that as well. So first of all, what is a high-pass filter? Well, first of all, let me say before we even define that, there are a couple of different names that you'll sometimes hear for these. I think the most common name is high-pass filter, and I think that's the term that is just traditionally more commonly used and used by engineers. The other terms I have heard are low-cut filter. That's probably the second most common, and in fact, you'll see that more on it's not just consumer devices. I was gonna say you see that more on consumer devices, but I don't think that's true. I will say, for example, though, the Zoom H1, there's a little switch on the back, and it says low cut instead of high pass. Same thing, technically, but going by just different names. I'm trying to think. Those are probably the two most common names. I think I have. It seems like on one of the Sennheiser mics in its documentation, it called it something else, and I'm trying to remember what it called it. It was something different. I think it was maybe a bass roll off or low roll off, something like that. So there are different kind of terms that you'll sometimes encounter as well. But the whole idea of a low pass or a high pass, high pass filter, low cut filter, is that it actually attenuates some of the low frequencies. That is to say, it does not it rolls off or it removes some of the low frequency sound from your audio. And there, a lot of people would ask, well, why would you ever want to do that? But that doesn't make any sense. And in fact, the different mics also sometimes we'll just show a symbol instead of having a name on it. And let me just show you here really quickly. Here's my Electro-Voice RE20. It does have a high-pass filter. I'm going to move the camera, so be prepared. It may get a little wobbly here for just a minute. There it is right there. This switch is the high-pass filter. You can see right now it is engaged. It's actually on this setting as opposed to this setting. This setting right here would be no effect, and this would be with the high-pass filter engaged, again, rolling off some of the bass frequency. Now, first question you may ask yourself is, why would you ever want to do that? Why would you ever want to remove some of the bass frequencies? Well, there are a couple reasons. Let me just walk through them. The first one is proximity effect, and that's in particular why I have it engaged on this particular microphone. Proximity effect is when you're working in close to the microphone. There is an effect that a lot of microphones exhibit, particularly microphones with a cardioid pickup pattern or some sort of cardioid pickup pattern, whether it be hyper, super, or just cardioid. The effect that they exhibit is that as you get closer, the bass response of the microphone increases, and it sounds like there's actually more bass there than there really is in real life. So that's one thing. And so a high-pass filter what that will do in that case is it will attenuate some of that bass response, so we'll start to sound a little bit more natural again. And in fact, that's why I use it on this particular microphone. This microphone, I think was originally made for radio broadcast. And the funny thing is that if you listen to a lot of stations, if I don't know how many of you listen to radio anymore, but just kind of Just a lot of times when you think about, FM radio announcers, a lot of them had these really rich, deep bass voices, and it would sound, it had a very distinct sound to it. And that was typically because they were working up so close on on a dynamic microphone of some sort with a cardioid pickup pattern like this. This was a very common one. The Shure SM7 and 7B were very common mics for that effect as well. If you get up close, the Shure SM58 is another example. You get up nice and close on that. In fact, a lot of performers would sometimes use that as an effect. So they'd work up really close on the mic to get that effect. So that's proximity effect, and that's one thing that you can sort of manage with a high-pass filter. It'll attenuate some of that bass response, making the mic therefore sound a little bit more natural. Now, I'm not saying you always need to use that for dynamic mics. I'm just saying that that's a choice you get to make. Do you want all that proximity effect? Do you want all that bass, or do you not? And so that's one way to manage it if you're not really interested in having that. All right. Another reason you might use a high-pass filter is if you have a lot of low-frequency energy in wherever you're recording for whatever reason. And that's going to come in a lot of different reasons. Number one, you can get it sometimes when you have a microphone on a boom pole or any sort of stand, or even handheld. Um, and what's happening there is you're getting some handling noise of various sorts, or vibration in the microphone. And when the microphone vibrates, that can cause the capsule of the microphone to vibrate at a relatively low frequency, which turns into what the mic picks that up as bass energy or bass noise, or bass sound, and it transfers that into the signal that you're recording. So if you are going to be booming a microphone, sometimes using a high-pass filter can help cut out some of that handling noise. And also, again, handheld as well. In fact, a lot of the coverage that I did recently at NAB, where I was using a handheld microphone, there was a fair bit of cable noise, actually. So the cable would move around. We had a relatively short cable. And actually, in that case, we were using a Audio-Technica, sorry, not an audio, a Sennheiser MD46. Very kind of a classic reporter's microphone. And we had it tethered to the camera. In this case, my friend Scott Vanderbilt was shooting with his Sony FS5, which has XLR inputs. We were going to use some wireless. There's a long story about why we didn't end up using wireless. And actually, I talked to some other people who tried to use wireless in the convention center as well. This is another, I'm going to take a little tangent, I apologize. But there were lots of issues with that. There was a lot of RF in the convention centers. And so some of them that tried to use it ended up not using it just because there was so much radio frequency going on in the convention center, and there was lots of interference and dropouts. So they abandoned that idea and went with a wired mic instead. We did that for another reason that I won't go into right now. But a lot of there was some noise that got transferred into the microphone from cable handling noise. And using a high-pass filter was able to help manage some of that, cut that out just a little bit. And again, that's another case where that kind of stuff comes through as low-frequency energy, so really low sounding, bass sounding kind of noises. That's another one. And again, the same thing can happen on a boom pole. And in fact, that's why on boom poles, typically you will see the professionals that when they are hand booming a mic, they will have a very serious suspension system. Rycote makes a number of those that have what they call a lyre system, which is kind of a plastic composite type material that suspends the microphone in various dimensions. So, the pieces that actually hold the microphone will have this. Actually, and let me just show you, do I have it here? No, I'd have to get up and go get it. But the Rode VideoMic Pro, the newer version that was released last year, also has this Rycote lyre system. These plastic suspension system that makes it so that when you do move whatever's holding the mic, whether that be your camera or a boom pole, that the lyre system absorbs some of that so it doesn't get transferred to the microphone capsule and it doesn't get picked up as low frequency noise. However, if some does get through, a high pass filter can help eliminate some of that as well. All right. There are other things as well. Wind is another one. What happens when you're outdoors in the wind and the wind happens to move across or hit the microphone capsule? That's actually relatively low frequency energy. And so it will move the capsule, and the capsule of the microphone will pick that up as low frequency sound or as bass sound. So using a high pass filter out in the wind can also help eliminate some of that sound or that energy that you pick up when you're working outdoors in the wind. So that can be helpful. It can also help for noise that you may not want to pick up. So, for example, if there's an air conditioner or a heater, forced air, in a room where you're recording and you don't have the ability to turn it off for whatever reason, or if there is a refrigerator or a freezer, anything that's making sort of a humming noise, a high pass filter can also help eliminate some of that as well. So those are some things you can kind of look to a high pass filter to help with in various situations. Now, that kind of covers when, what a high pass filter is, when you might want to use it. However, it's important to keep in mind there's a potential cost to using a high pass filter. And it depends on the high pass filter itself. So on some microphones, the high pass filter is fairly aggressive. And what I mean by that, and let's actually just show you here. Where did Audition go? 1 second. There it is. Okay, here we have Adobe Audition, which we've all seen before. And here I just have some audio. What I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to amplify this a little bit. Not too far. I want to clip it. We'll just go there for now. Okay. Then if I come up here into Effects, Filter and EQ, and choose, let's just use a Parametric Equalizer. All right. You'll notice down here I have this one band that I can use, this EQ that says HP. HP stands for high pass. When I turn that on, you can see what happens. So right here on the screen, you can see that these are the low frequency sounds over here, the bass sounds, high frequency sounds over here, treble, and the mid-range over here. What you can see is that when I turn this high pass filter on, you can see it's actually cutting off some of this bass sound over here, this bass frequency. And you can change a variety of parameters here. You can go very, very mild to far more extreme. So here's a very aggressive high pass filter. But one thing you'll notice here, if I go to something a little bit more sane, let's go to maybe a 24. And actually, you'll also see it represented this way often, dBs per octave. Just so you're aware, that's often how it will be represented. We won't go into great detail on that, but that just refers to how steep this curve is here, how aggressively it's going to cut off the bass frequencies. But you can see here, I have it set to 100 hertz, but you'll notice something. If we look at 100 hertz here, it's actually cut off some before it even gets to 100 hertz. So 100 hertz is actually kind of the center point of the curve. So when you see the specifications for a high pass filter and you say, okay, there's a high pass filter in this microphone and it is at 85 hertz. What that means technically is it's going to start cutting off some of the bass before 85 hertz, but it's centered at 85 hertz. And in this case, for example, it's centered at 100 hertz, but it's actually cut off some of the material probably down here in about the 140 hertz range. It starts to cut off, and then it curves down from there. So that's one thing to know about high pass filters. And why I say that is something you need to understand is that if you have a microphone and it says that its high pass filter is set at 250 hertz, let's actually just go do that right now. It's cutting off a lot of material up here. So it's cutting off way up here, starting at probably even before 300 hertz, closer to 400 hertz. So it's cutting off a lot of bass material. Now, just for reference, dialogue audio, at least for men's voices, often goes down into the 100 hertz range. In some men's voices, even a little bit lower than that. Even women's voices will have some energy down in this range. So if you engage a high pass filter that is centered at 250 hertz, it's going to cut off a lot of the bass response, and it's going to start to sound really, really thin. So it's kind of a trade-off at that point where, yeah, you're going to be able to get rid of a lot of the handling noise. You're going to be able to get rid of a lot of the other noise in the room, like maybe a refrigerator, an air conditioner. But you're also going to lose some of the bass response or the bass sound that you may want. So it's there's definitely a potential cost here. Actually, let's show you a closer view here. All right, so if you have a microphone that has a high pass filter centered at 250 hertz, and I have seen them go this high, and in fact, the Sennheiser MKH50, I was surprised at how aggressive the high pass filter that was built into that microphone went. And in fact, I would find that to be the type of high pass filter that I would only use in an absolute emergency because it was so aggressive that it made voices sound relatively thin. So that's just something you want to understand when you're buying a microphone, if it does have a high pass filter, or if you're using a microphone that has a high pass filter, you definitely want to experiment with it first so you can understand how extreme or how aggressive it is and whether or not that's something you want to use for the particular sound you're going for. So definitely something to keep in mind and consider when you're looking at using a high pass filter. All right, let's go ahead and close that for now. All right. So one of the big questions then comes, okay, well, there are high pass filters that are built into microphones, but there are also high pass filters that are built into your um, recorder, perhaps. And then you can also use high pass filters, of course, like we were just doing here in software in post. So when should you use your high pass filter? And this is getting back to Gary's question that he asked before. When does it make most sense to use a high pass filter in post and not even bother with it during production while you're recording? When does it make sense to do it in your recorder? And when does it make sense to do it with your microphone? Well, you have choices, and there are trade-offs, just like always, depending on the different choice that you decide to use if you are going to use a high pass filter. So here's the short version. The short version is it can make a difference where you apply the high pass filter. So let me just show you here. If you use it in your microphone, the high pass filtering is taking place before the audio ever gets to the recorder, which means it's taking place before it ever gets to the preamplifier, which means it's also taking place before, again, for those that have taken the course, you understand there is also an analog to digital converter after the preamplifier that takes the microphone level signal and amplifies it up to a line level signal. So high pass is already done before then. And then once you're in the digital domain and you come over here into post, it's also been applied before you get to this point as well. Now, why does that matter? You can do it at any of those places. You can do it in the microphone before you get to the preamplifier. You can do it in your recorder, and different recorders apply high pass at different places. So, for example, sound devices, in most of those cases, as I understand, they actually apply the high pass filter before the signal is amplified in the preamplifier, which is pretty unique, as we'll see in just a minute. A lot of the consumer or prosumer level recorders, the Tascams, the Zooms, those all apply the high pass filter in the recorder after the signal has gone through the preamplifier, after it's gone through the analog to digital converter, and then it applies the high pass filter. So that's one thing. And then, of course, in post, it's done well after the audio has been converted to digital. So that's a consideration there as well. Let me explain why. So sound devices actually in their recorders and mixers put the high pass filter before the preamplifier. It's actually an analog high pass filter. It's done before the audio goes through the preamplifier. Their claim is that, and this applies to the same to microphones that have their own high pass filter, because again, that's all done in the analog domain. Their claim is that if you do the high pass filtering before the preamplifier and before the analog to digital conversion, you can actually potentially have more headroom. And if we look here at this audio on the screen right now, this is in the digital domain, but the idea of headroom is how much room do you have between the peaks in your audio and the top limit of digital audio, which is 0 dB. So how much room do you have there? That's headroom. And you can actually get more headroom if you take care of the high pass filtering before it's converted or before it's amplified or converted to digital. And so in practical terms, what that means is that your audio is likely to engage a limiter. So you're not going to have to do as much limiting. And your audio is less likely to clip as well. So you can actually turn the gain up a little bit higher, get a little bit more of the signal that you're trying to get, and less of the signal you're not trying to get. So that's a fairly subtle thing. I don't generally find that absolutely critical, but you will find plenty of pros that will say, you know what, I want all that extra headroom. And actually, when I say all that extra headroom, often it's not that much more headroom, but it is more headroom. So it is a consideration. So that's why a lot of times pros will prefer to use the high pass filter in their microphone or in their professional grade recorder if it has it implemented in the analog stage. Now, on the Zoom and the Tascam recorders, the high pass filter is actually implemented in the digital stage. So it's after the audio has gone through the preamplifier and it's gone through the analog to digital converter, then it applies its high pass filter. So to me, that's the same as applying it in post in an application like Adobe Audition, because the audio has already been through the preamplifier. It's already been through the analog to digital converter. So it's too late to get yourself any additional headroom that may come as a result of doing it in the analog stage. So my take is generally it's not all that helpful to necessarily. There's no big advantage to applying a high pass filter on a Zoom or a Tascam recorder generally. That's just doing it in post. So you may as well do it in post. It can be helpful if you want to hear what it sounds like when you're in production. So before you start recording, if you are hearing that low frequency rumble from, say, for example, some handling noise, you can apply the high pass filter and just see what it's going to sound like. So that doesn't hurt before you start recording. You can also apply it on your microphone and see what happens there if your microphone has a high pass filter. And then, of course, if you do have a higher grade professional type of mixer or recorder, of course, I almost always have it engaged at a relatively low frequency. So, for example, when I'm recording dialogue with my Sound Devices 633, I'll almost always turn the high pass filter on and center it at about 80 hertz. So it's not going to cut into the dialogue a whole lot, but it does give me a little protection as far as handling noise is concerned with the boom microphone. All right, so I covered a lot of the things I wanted to cover there. Let me give you a little demonstration here of what I mean by this additional headroom that you might get by using a high-pass filter that's in the analog domain. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that demonstration. Sorry. What I meant to say is what I'm demonstrating here is one thing to keep in mind is that a high-pass filter can actually affect your waveform of your audio. Watch this. This is interesting. So here's some just dialogue. This is actually my voice. And there's a couple things going on here. Kind of the main thing I want you to look at here is you can see this waveform is actually a little bit asymmetric. And that's quite common actually with men's voices. Certain men's voices tend to be more asymmetric than others in terms of the waveforms. Mine tends to be fairly asymmetric. What I mean by that is notice the peak here on this waveform. If we come in a little bit closer. All right, there's a center line here, the infinity, minus infinity, which is right down the center. Notice that the peaks on the lower end of the waveform right here are peaking at about minus 3.5 dB, but on the upper end, they're peaking at about minus 8 dB. So that's what I would refer to as an asymmetric waveform. That is to say, the peaks are a lot larger here than they are here. Now watch what happens if we come up here to Effects, Filter and EQ, Parametric Equalizer. We're going to go ahead and apply our high-pass filter. I'm not even going to get too extreme. I'm going to pull it down some. And let's say here, for example, I would go at 80 hertz. This is kind of typically where I would apply a high-pass filter. And usually it's not quite so extreme, probably more in the 12. Or maybe 18. Let's go 18. Watch what happens to the waveform when we apply this. It actually didn't change it a whole lot, but notice that that waveform we were looking at here changed some. Now the peaks, and I'm not positive. I think maybe it was this one here. Let's look at this one here. This one now is peaking at about minus 3.5 and minus 7. So it's actually evened it up some. Actually, so this is an illustration of what I was originally saying as well. So you can see that actually in this particular case, the waveforms aren't quite as asymmetric as they were. Also, you can see that it changes the, our headroom overall. Let's undo that and actually just see what it did. I think it could make it worse in some cases too. Yeah, here it actually made it worse. So if I reapply that, so here it's right now peaking at minus 3. Let's redo that. Now in this case, it actually bumped it down to minus 2.5. So it actually changes the waveform in some ways. So that's something to keep in mind, that there's another potential cost of waveforms, or sorry, of using a digital high pass filter, is it can change the amount of headroom that you have in unpredictable ways. In some ways, it can get better. In some cases, it can get worse. So that's just something to keep in mind here. I've noticed, however, not all high pass filters are the same. So here's the thing. Watch this. If I open this same audio here in another application, we're going to go to Isotope RX5. Okay, so watch what happens here. Let me just use this corrective EQ here. I'm going to go back to default. It so happens that I have a high pass filter here, so I'll turn that on. And let's watch to see what happens here. Let's go less extreme. So 12 dB for octave. And I'm going to put it up at, let's put it about 80 hertz like that. Let's see if any changes occur to the waveform now. Notice it didn't change the waveform. So I found that there are certain high-pass filters that will affect the waveform and its symmetry, whether it's asymmetric or not asymmetric, and others won't affect it. And this one didn't affect it at all. It just rolled off some of that low frequency, and yet the waveform itself didn't change in terms of its symmetry, how much of it was above the minus infinity line and how much was below. So not all high-pass filters do the processing the same way. And that's why I found, here's another example of where I found that RX actually is a lot, is a lot more, it's a lot more gentle with your audio. It still gets the job done, but it doesn't affect it in unpredictable ways. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So if you are going to apply a high pass filter, watch your waveform and see what happens to it when you apply it, because it can start to do some funny things if you're not careful. That's something you'll also want to do some experimenting with. If you have a high pass filter on your microphone, check to see if it changes the waveform in some way. So do a test, engage the high pass filter, record a little bit of dialogue, stop the recorder, turn the, disengage the high pass filter, do another recording, and see how the waveform is different. Because you'll want to know that up front. In terms of, how is it going to affect the audio? So that way you're not surprised in post after you have some gig, some job that's important to you or important to your client or friends or whomever you're doing it for. You'll want to make sure you're not doing anything that hurts the audio, but only helps the audio. All right, so there's a little bit of coverage on high-pass filters. I hope that was helpful for you today, and thanks for those that have joined us here. We will have more sessions coming up every week, as always, and we'll go ahead and keep posting more on the regular YouTube channel as well, as far as audio and actually in that case lighting as well. Little status update on the post-processing, audio post-processing course. That's taken a lot longer than I thought. I really want to make something, of course, that's valuable to you, that's meaningful, that's helpful, and it takes a lot of work. And so I had hoped originally to have it ready by the start of this year. Obviously, that's come and gone right now in May. And I have started on it. And my plan at this point is to continue working on it. And I'll be taking a week where I kind of set aside a full week to work on finishing up the course this summer. So it's going to be in July. I apologize that it's taken so much longer. But again, I want to make sure it's something that's really useful and meaningful to you and valuable for the money that it will cost. So there's our status update on that. Thanks again for the questions. Thanks again for all your support. And we'll talk to you guys again real soon.